They told Dr. Yemi Ademikross that humans didn't belong in space on a Tuesday morning. In a conference room on the 14th floor of the Galactic Assembly's Technology Licensing Bureau on Varath Station, by a panel of 3 assessors who had clearly decided before she walked in and were doing her the professional courtesy of explaining why. The lead assessor was a Theresi named Voskel, who had been reviewing propulsion license applications for 22 years, and who had in 22 years approved 41 applications and rejected 209, and who had the specific quality of bureaucratic certainty that comes from having made the same decision so many times that it no longer felt like a decision. He said, reading from the assessment form, the proposed drive architecture presents unacceptable risk parameters for operation by a species without verified neural synchronization capability, which is the biological prerequisite for safe operation of corridor-class propulsion systems under the Assembly's Technology Licensing Framework, Section 12, Subsection 7. Humanity does not meet this prerequisite. Application denied. He stamped the form. The other 2 assessors stamped their copies. Voskel looked up, which was the courtesy part, and said, "You are welcome to reapply when your species' biological assessment is updated." Yemi said, "How long does a biological assessment update take?" He said, "Approximately 40 years depending on the species' development trajectory." She said, "40 years." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." She picked up her copy of the application and her case, and walked out of the conference room and took the elevator to the ground floor and walked out of the Technology Licensing Bureau into the corridor of Varath Station and stood there for a moment, looking at the ordinary daily traffic of 100 species going about their business, and she thought, 40 years. Then she thought, no. Then she went back to her hotel room and opened her laptop and began redesigning the drive. The thing about Section 12, Subsection 7 was that it was written for a specific kind of drive. The corridor-class propulsion systems that the Assembly's framework regulated were systems that worked by creating a navigational interface between the vessel's drive core and the corridor's quantum geometry, a process that required, at the interface point, a biological operator capable of processing the corridor's sensory data directly in real time without the delay that digital mediation introduced. Neural synchronization was not a preference. It was a physical requirement of the process. Species with the right neural architecture could do it. Species without it could not. And if they tried, the delay between the corridor's data and the operator's response created a feedback loop that the drive's safety systems could not compensate for, and the feedback loop destroyed the vessel. The Assembly had been very clear about this in Section 12, Subsection 7. The Assembly had also been very clear about it in the 7 rejection letters that Yemi had received from the Bureau in the preceding 4 years, each one stamped with a different assessor's name and each one saying the same thing: neural synchronization prerequisite not met, reapply in 40 years. Yemi had read all 7 letters. She had also, in the 4 years between the first letter and the 8th application, read everything that had ever been published about corridor-class propulsion systems, about neural synchronization requirements, about the quantum geometry of assembly corridors, and about the 7 other species whose applications had been rejected for the same prerequisite failure, all of which had subsequently either waited 40 years or found a different solution. She was interested in the species that had found a different solution. There were 3 of them. Their solutions had not involved improving their neural synchronization capability. Their solutions had involved asking a different question than the one the Bureau expected them to ask. And Yemi, who had spent 4 years reading about them, had arrived at a question that no one had asked yet, and she thought it was the right question. And she had gone to the Bureau to ask the Bureau to help her answer it, and the Bureau had stamped the form and told her to come back in 40 years. And now she was in her hotel room with her laptop open and the question in her head, and 40 years of waiting that she was absolutely not going to do. The question was this: Section 12, Subsection 7 required neural synchronization for corridor-class propulsion because corridor-class propulsion required real-time biological interface at the drive core. Every drive that used corridor quantum geometry was built on the assumption that the interface was biological. The assumption was not in the regulation. The regulation said biological operator. It did not say biological interface. If the interface was not biological, if the real-time quantum geometry processing was handled by a system that was not a neural synchronization, not a biological operator, not anything that Section 12, Subsection 7 had been written to regulate, then Section 12, Subsection 7 did not apply, and the Bureau's rejection was based on a question that the system did not ask. The question the system did not ask was, what if the drive doesn't need a biological interface at all? Every drive in the Assembly's registry used one. Every drive the Bureau had ever licensed used one. The three species that had found different solutions had found different ways to achieve neural synchronization, not different ways to eliminate the requirement for it. No one had eliminated the requirement, because the requirement came from the physics of corridor quantum geometry, and the physics said you needed real-time processing at the interface point, and real-time processing at that speed required biological neural architecture, and biological neural architecture required a species with the right kind of brain. Yemi had read all of this. She had also read, 6 months before her 8th application, a paper published in the Assembly's Journal of Theoretical Propulsion by a Veth mathematician named Comvel, a different Comvel than the threshold model scholar, a coincidence of Veth naming conventions, who had proposed in purely theoretical terms a mathematical architecture for corridor geometry processing that did not require real-time interface, but instead precomputed the corridor's quantum states using a probabilistic model updated at intervals fast enough to compensate for the feedback problem. The paper was theoretical. Comvel had noted in the conclusion that building a physical system capable of the required computation speed was beyond current assembly technology by approximately 2 orders of magnitude. Yemi had read that conclusion and written in the margin of her printed copy, or beyond current assembly materials science. Then she had underlined it. Then she had made a list. The list was of every material in the Assembly's public database whose computational properties had been measured and published. The list was long. The Assembly's materials science database was one of the most comprehensive scientific records in the known galaxy, because the Assembly had 61 member species and several hundred years of collaborative research. And collaborative research between 61 species produces an enormous amount of materials science data. Yemi worked through the list methodically over 3 months, filtering for materials whose computational speed properties were within the range that Comvel's architecture required. Most were not close. Some were in the right neighborhood but failed on other parameters: thermal stability, structural integrity under drive stress, cost of production, availability in quantities sufficient for a drive core. 12 materials were in the right range on every parameter. Of those 12, 7 were controlled substances under the Assembly's materials licensing framework, accessible only to licensed propulsion manufacturers. 5 were uncontrolled. Of those 5, 3 were available in quantities sufficient for a prototype drive core at a cost that Yemi's research grant could support barely, if she was careful, and if nothing went wrong, which things always did. But carefully managed wrong was different from catastrophic wrong, and Yemi had spent 4 years becoming an expert in the difference. She submitted a materials acquisition request to the Assembly's Research Supply Network on a Friday afternoon and received confirmation of available stock on Monday morning. And on Tuesday, she booked a transport to the Outer Zone fabrication facility that her university's engineering department maintained for large-scale experimental work. And on Wednesday, she packed her case and her laptop and a thermos that she had owned for 12 years and that she considered a necessary item for any project that was going to be difficult. And on Thursday, she left Verath Station and went to work. The fabrication facility was on a small outer zone research station called KET-4, which had been established 40 years ago as a collaborative research installation by 3 universities from 3 species, and which had over 40 years acquired the specific character of places that are far from the center of things and have been doing serious work for a long time. It was not impressive to look at. It was extremely well equipped in the specific areas where serious work required good equipment, and the people who worked there had the focused, slightly distracted quality of people who are thinking about problems that are more interesting than their surroundings. Yemi fit in immediately, which she had known she would, because she had the same quality and had known since she was 11 years old that the best places for her were places where the work was more interesting than everything else. She was given a workshop, an equipment allocation, and a junior research assistant named Tarin Moschen, who was 24 years old, and had been assigned to the facility for a doctoral program in experimental propulsion physics, and who had, when told his new supervisor was Dr. Yemi Ademi-Cross, looked up her publication record and spent an evening reading it, and arrived at the workshop the next morning with the specific energy of someone who has just realized they are going to be involved in something they will tell people about for the rest of their life. He did not say this. He said, "What do you need me to do?" She said, "Read this." She handed him Comvel's paper. He read it. He said, "This says the computation speed required is 2 orders of magnitude beyond current technology." She said, "Current assembly technology." He said, "What's the difference?" She handed him the materials list. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Oh." She said, "Yes." He said, "Has anyone tried this?" She said, "No." He said, "Why not?" She said because the paper is theoretical and the materials list requires reading two separate databases and cross-referencing them, and most people who read Comvell's paper are theorists who don't read materials databases, and most people who read materials databases are engineers who don't read theoretical propulsion papers. He said, so it fell between the gaps. She said, everything useful falls between the gaps. That's where we're going to work. The prototype took 14 months. 14 months was fast for a drive core of this complexity. And it was fast because Yemi and Taran work the way people work when they are doing something that has not been done before and that they are certain needs to be done, not frantically, which produces errors, but continuously with the kind of sustained attention that makes 14 months feel like a single extended problem being solved rather than a series of days. They had failures. The first computational lattice they assembled using the primary material from the list held for 3 test cycles, and failed on the fourth when a thermal expansion coefficient they had underestimated by a small margin produced a stress fracture in the lattice's 7th layer that propagated to the 9th layer before the safety system caught it. They rebuilt the lattice with the corrected coefficient, and it held for 11 cycles. The second failure was not a materials failure but a design failure. The probabilistic model they were using for corridor state computation was accurate but not accurate enough at the tails of the probability distribution, which meant that in the scenarios that were most unlike the baseline, the model's predictions diverged from the actual corridor states by a margin that was still within safety parameters, but that would grow as the divergence accumulated. They spent 3 weeks redesigning the model's tail behavior. The redesigned model was more computationally expensive but more accurate, and the materials lattice handled the additional computational load without new failures, and Taran at the end of the 3 weeks ran the performance projections and said, it's going to work. Yemi said, run them again. He ran them again. He said, it's going to work. She said, run them a third time with the worst-case scenario parameters. He ran them with the worst-case scenario parameters and said, it's going to work with a 12% safety margin. She said, that's enough. He said, just enough. She said, enough is enough. And she was right because enough was the word she had been working toward for 14 months, and arriving at it felt exactly the way she had known it would feel, which was not like relief and not like triumph, but like a door opening into a room you built yourself. The prototype test was conducted at Ket-4's outer test range, which was a region of open space 2 light minutes from the station that the facility used for drive tests that were not safe to conduct closer to inhabited structures. The test required a vessel, and the vessel they had was a 12-meter research shuttle that the facility used for equipment transport, and that Yemi had spent 6 weeks modifying to accept the prototype drive core, which had been an engineering challenge of a different kind than the drive itself. The shuttle's existing propulsion architecture had not been designed with anything like the prototype in mind. And fitting the two together required the kind of creative structural improvisation that Yemi had not done since her graduate work, when she had spent a summer making equipment that was not designed to work together, and which she had found she still knew how to do. Taran handled the interface software. Yemi handled the physical integration. They had 2 other researchers from the facility helping with the instrumentation, a Chethani engineer named Vosbale, who had been at Ket-4 for 12 years, and who had a reputation for making instruments measure things they were not designed to measure, and a Mhan physicist named Rethsen who had done his doctoral work on corridor quantum geometry, and who had read Comvell's paper 8 years ago and had written in his own notebook at the time. Theoretically interesting, practically impossible, and who had been revising that assessment since Yemi arrived at Ket-4 and started building the thing he had called practically impossible. The 4 of them ran pre-test checks for 2 days. The checks were clean. On the morning of the 3rd day, Yemi sat in the modified shuttle's pilot seat, which was not designed for anyone to be in during a prototype drive test, because prototype drive tests were supposed to be unmanned. And Yemi had decided to be in it anyway, because she had been building this for 14 months and she was going to be the first person to know if it worked. And she was not going to know that from a monitoring station 2 light minutes away. Taran, who had tried to object and who had been given the specific look that ended objections, ran the final pre-test sequence from the monitoring station and said over the comm, all clear, she said, starting the sequence. The drive core came up. The corridor that the prototype accessed was a minor one, not a major transit route, not a commercially significant path. A small geometric feature of the local space that the assembly's corridor mapping database listed as a Category 4 anomaly, barely large enough for a 12-meter shuttle, and which Yemi had selected specifically because the only thing a Category 4 anomaly was good for was testing a drive system that no one was certain would work in a way that did not endanger anyone except the person in the shuttle who had decided to be there. The computational lattice processed the corridor's quantum geometry. The probabilistic model updated. The drive interfaced with the corridor's geometry without a biological neural synchronization, using instead the lattice's computational speed and the model's predictive accuracy, and the interface held. The shuttle entered the corridor. It crossed it. It came out the other side 11 seconds after entry, at the coordinates the model had predicted within 20 meters of the predicted position, which was within the model's stated accuracy range, which meant the model had worked, and the lattice had worked, and the drive had worked, and the shuttle was on the other side of a corridor that Section 12, Subsection 7 of the Assembly's Technology Licensing Framework said a human being could not take a vessel through. And the human being in the pilot seat of the shuttle sat for a moment in the specific silence that follows the completion of something you have been working toward for a long time. And then she said over the comm to Taran and Vospale and Rethsen at the monitoring station, 11 seconds. How was the data? Taran's voice when it came back had the quality of someone trying to be professionally calm and not fully succeeding. The data is perfect. She said, define perfect. I mean the data is exactly what the model predicted. She said, within tolerance. He said, within tolerance. She said, run the analysis before we say anything else. He said, I'm running it. He ran it. It took 40 minutes during which Yemi sat in the shuttle and drank from the thermos and looked at the stars and felt the specific feeling of a door she had opened herself and thought about the conference room on the 14th floor and Voskel stamping the form and thought, not 40 years. The analysis confirmed what the pretest model had predicted, which was what Comvel's theoretical architecture had described, which was that a corridor-class propulsion system that did not require biological neural synchronization was physically possible, and had just been physically demonstrated by a 12-meter research shuttle in a Category 4 corridor anomaly in the outer zone of Ket 4's research range. Yemi filed a test report with the facility's research record and a copy with the Assembly's Journal of Applied Propulsion that same evening, because scientific results belonged in the record, and the record was where they became real in the way that things become real when other people can see them and verify them and build on them. She also filed the following morning a 9th application with the Assembly's Technology Licensing Bureau, under a different section of the framework than Section 12. Under Section 3, which governed novel propulsion architectures not covered by existing licensing categories, and which required an assessment by a panel of technical experts rather than the standard prerequisite checklist that had produced 8 previous rejections. The application included the full technical documentation for the drive architecture, the test data, Comvel's theoretical paper, the materials analysis, and a cover letter that was 4 sentences long. The cover letter said, the attached application describes a corridor-class propulsion system that does not require biological neural synchronization and therefore falls outside the scope of Section 12, Subsection 7. The system has been successfully tested as the attached data demonstrates. We are requesting assessment under Section 3 for novel architectures. We look forward to your review. She did not say, I was told humans don't belong in space. She did not say, I have been rejected 8 times. She did not say anything about the conference room or Voskel or the 40 years. She did not need to. The application said everything that needed to be said, and it said it in the language that mattered, which was data, and data did not need context to be understood by people who knew how to read it. The Bureau's Section 3 panel convened 6 weeks after the application was received. Section 3 panels were different from the standard assessment panels that had reviewed Yemi's previous 8 applications. They were composed not of licensing officers, but of working engineers and physicists from the Assembly's member species, specialists in the relevant technical areas, selected for their ability to evaluate novel architectures on their technical merits rather than against a checklist of existing categories. The panel for Yemi's application had 5 members, a Veth propulsion theorist who had cited Comvel's paper in his own work and who had been thinking about its implications for practical applications since it was published, a Thoresi engineer who had worked on corridor-class drive systems for 30 years, and who read the technical documentation and then read it again and then made 3 pages of notes before the panel meeting. A Chethani materials scientist whose specialization was computational lattice design and who spent the week before the meeting running her own analysis on Yemi's materials selection and finding it not just correct, but, in her assessment, elegant. The word she used in her pre-meeting notes was elegant, because the materials choice solved 3 separate problems simultaneously in a way that was more than functional. It was aesthetically satisfying in the way that good engineering is aesthetically satisfying when the solution is the right shape for the problem, and 2 others whose names were less relevant to the outcome because they arrived at the panel having already decided from the documentation that the architecture was sound. And what they were there to do was ask the questions that would confirm what the documentation already showed. The panel met for 2 days. Yemi attended the first day in person and the second day by relay from Ket 4. The questions were technical and specific, and she answered them with the precision that 14 months of building had produced in her. The precision of someone who has made every mistake that a design can produce and has learned from each one and has the learning available at immediate recall, because it is not information stored in memory, but knowledge embedded in the hands that built the thing. At the end of the second day, the panel's chair, the Veth propulsion theorist, said, "We have no further technical questions." Yemi said, "Does that mean what I think it means?" He said, "It means that the architecture is sound, the test data is valid, and there is no basis under Section 3 for rejection. It also means that you have produced something that the field did not think was possible, and that the field is going to need some time to catch up with what you have done, and that the licensing approval will come through in the standard 30-day processing window, and that I recommend you use those 30 days to prepare for a significant amount of attention, because the Journal of Applied Propulsion published your test report 3 weeks ago, and the attention has already started." The attention was not entirely positive. This was not surprising to Yemi, who had spent 4 years receiving rejection letters and who understood that new things received 2 kinds of attention: the attention of people who understood what the new thing meant and wanted to build on it, and the attention of people who understood what the new thing meant and wanted to argue with it. Both kinds were useful. The people who wanted to build on it included, within 3 months of the journal publication, 7 research teams from 5 species who had contacted Yemi or Taran or the facility directly to ask about collaboration, licensing, and access to the design documentation. 2 of them were from existing corridor drive manufacturers who had, on reading the paper, realized that the computational lattice architecture could be applied to their existing drive systems to reduce the neural synchronization burden on biological operators, which was not the application Yemi had been designing for but which W. as a legitimate use of the architecture and which she was happy to discuss because the point was the architecture working, not controlling the specific form it took. The people who wanted to argue with it were, by and large, arguing with a version of the paper they had not fully read, and Yemi's response to those arguments was to point them to the section of the paper they had not read, which usually resolved the argument or transformed it into a technical discussion, which was better than an argument. The one argument that was not easily resolved was the one that came from the Bureau itself, not from Voskel, who had approved the licensing in the standard 30-day window and who had done so correctly and professionally and had not commented publicly on the previous 8 rejections or on the relationship between them and the current approval, but from the Bureau's legal division, which had identified a question that the licensing approval had created and that no one had thought to address before the approval because the approval was novel and novel things create questions that the existing framework does not have answers for. The question was, what did the licensing approval mean for Section 12, subsection 7? The architecture was licensed. The architecture bypassed the neural synchronization requirement. Did the approval mean that the requirement was no longer applicable to vessels using the architecture? Or did it mean that the requirement still applied and the architecture was a licensed exception? And if it was a licensed exception, under what terms? And did those terms apply to all human vessels using the architecture or only to the specific configuration that had been tested? And if only the specific configuration, what counted as the same configuration and who determined that? And under what framework? The legal division filed a formal inquiry with the Bureau's policy office. The policy office acknowledged the inquiry and estimated a response timeline of 6 to 18 months. While the legal division's inquiry worked its way through the Bureau's policy process, which was not fast because policy processes are not designed to be fast, and the Bureau's policy office had 41 other open inquiries and was staffed at the level appropriate for a typical year's volume, and this was not a typical year, Yemi returned to Ket 4 and kept working. The prototype test had demonstrated the architecture. The architecture worked. What she was building now was not a prototype. She had, with the licensing approval in hand and the collaboration requests from 7 research teams, and the materials acquisition process significantly simplified by the fact that she was now a licensed drive manufacturer rather than an experimental researcher, begun work on the first full-scale drive core, not for a 12-meter research shuttle, but for a vessel of the size that corridor-class propulsion was actually designed for. The vessel she was building it for was not a commercial vessel and not a military vessel and not a government vessel. It was her vessel. She had been designing it in parallel with the drive core for the past 8 months, which Taran had discovered when he found the design files on the shared drive and had come to her workshop and said, "You're building a ship." She had said, "I'm building a ship." He had said, when were you going to tell me? She had said, when it was ready to tell. He had said, can I help? She had said, you're already on it. He had looked at the design files, which he had clearly already been looking at before he came to her workshop, and had said, the drive integration is going to be complicated. She had said, yes. He had said, the hull geometry you've chosen for the drive mounting is unusual. She had said, it's what the drive needs. He had said, I know, I ran the models, it works, but it's unusual. She had said, most things that work are unusual before they're common. He had looked at her for a moment and then gone back to his workstation and opened the hull geometry files and begun the structural analysis, which was what she had known he would do, and why she had put him on the project 8 months ago without telling him. The vessel that took shape over the following 16 months at Ket-4's fabrication bay was not large by corridor-class standards. It was 38 meters, crew capacity of 12, designed for long-range independent operation in the outer zone without the supply chain dependence that larger vessels required. It was designed to be operated by a human crew without neural synchronization, using the computational lattice drive system that was now fully licensed and had been through 4 additional test cycles in progressively larger configurations, all of which had performed within the model's parameters. It was not designed to be impressive. It was designed to work, which is a different design philosophy and one that produces vessels that people who value restiveness find disappointing, and people who value function find exactly right. Yemi named it the Ades, after the administrative officer at Earth's diplomatic mission on Verath Station who had, in the 17 years Yemi had been working on this project, twice forwarded bureaucratic inquiries to the correct department with enough speed that timing had mattered, and who had never known that she had done anything significant, and who deserved to have a ship named after her because the work of being precise and reliable in the administrative layer of large systems is the work that makes everything else possible and that almost never gets named. Taran, when told the name, looked it up in the Assembly's personnel database, found the administrative record and said, she's a station officer. Yemi said, yes, he said, you named the ship after a station officer. She said, I named the ship after someone who did her job well when it mattered and never made it about herself. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's a good reason to name a ship after someone. She said, most reasons to name things after people are good reasons. We just don't do it often enough. The Ades' first flight was not a test flight. Yemi did not believe in test flights for vessels she had built herself, because a vessel she had built herself was a vessel whose every system she understood at the level of having built it, and she trusted that understanding more than she trusted any test protocol, and the best test of a vessel was flight, and flight was what she did. She filed the flight plan with Ket-4's traffic authority on a Thursday morning and departed at 1400 hours with Taran as co-pilot and Rethsen as the mission's scientific observer and 4 other crew members from the facility who had been part of the build in various capacities, and who had been asked if they wanted to be on the first flight, and had all said yes without taking time to consider it. The flight plan included 3 corridor transits, not Category 4 anomalies, but Category 2 corridors, the kind that were used by regular commercial traffic and that the Assembly's licensing framework had before this flight required neural synchronization to navigate. The first transit was clean. The second transit was clean. The third transit, which connected to the Velith corridor system and which put the Ades into one of the most commercially active transit regions in the outer zone, was clean. And when the vessel emerged from the transit point and Rethsen's instruments confirmed the position and the navigation system updated its location display to show the Velith corridor's familiar geometry, Taran said nothing for a moment and then said, we're here. Yemi said, yes. He said, we just flew a human-built ship through a Category 2 corridor without neural synchronization. She said, yes. He said, using a drive system that the Bureau told you 8 times couldn't be built. She said, they didn't say it couldn't be built. They said we didn't have the biological prerequisite to operate it, he said, and she said, and they were right about that. He looked at her. She said, they said humans need neural synchronization to operate corridor drives. That was true. We do not have neural synchronization. That was also true. What they did not say, because they did not know to say it, was that neural synchronization was not the only way to solve the problem that corridor drives need solved. We solved it a different way. They were right that humans don't belong in space the way they defined belonging. We belong in space the way we define it, which is that we built a ship and it works and we are here. The Ades logged 47 corridor transits in its first year of operation. 47 transits across 19 different corridor classifications, from Category 4 anomalies to Category 1 major transit routes, each one logged with the full technical data that Yemi filed with the Assembly's Journal of Applied Propulsion as part of an ongoing operational study that was, in its second year, one of the most cited papers in the field. The transits were clean. Not uniformly, There were 6 events in the first year where the drive's predictive model encountered corridor state conditions that fell in the tails of the probability distribution, and where the safety margin was closer than Yemi preferred. And she documented each of those events in detail and used them to refine the model. Because events that stress the margin are the events that improve the system if you document them honestly and apply what the documentation shows. By the end of the first year, the refined model had reduced the frequency of tail distribution events by 60% and improved the safety margin in those events by 30%. By the end of the second year, 4 other human research teams had built drives using the licensed architecture, and 2 commercial shipping companies had licensed it for Thay. Our new vessel classes, and the Assembly's Technology Licensing Bureau had, after 14 months of policy review, issued a formal ruling that the computational lattice architecture constituted a valid alternative compliance pathway for Section 12, Subsection 7, which meant that any vessel using the architecture was in compliance with the neural synchronization requirement, not by meeting the requirement, but by making the requirement inapplicable. Which was the distinction Yemi had identified in the conference room on the 14th floor and had spent 4 years building into a physical demonstration. The ruling was noted in the Bureau's official record. It was also, though no one at the Bureau said this publicly, the first time in the Bureau's history that a licensing denial had been answered not with an appeal or a challenge or a legal argument but with a prototype, and the prototype had worked, and the working had made the denial irrelevant, and the irrelevance was the answer. And the answer had taken 4 years and 14 months and 1 small ship named after a station officer who did her job well and never made it about herself. Voskel retired from the Bureau 3 years after the D's first flight. His retirement was unremarkable in the way of long careers that end correctly. He had reviewed applications for 22 years and had approved 47 and rejected 212, and had done his job within the framework he had been given, and the framework had been correct at the time it was written, and had become incomplete when the architecture it did not anticipate was built. And that was not his failure and not the framework's failure, but simply what happens when the world changes faster than the documentation that describes it. He did not comment publicly on the Adami-Cross applications or the ADs or the Bureau's revised ruling. He attended his retirement reception, accepted the institutional acknowledgement of 22 years of service, and went home. What he said privately, in the message he sent to the Bureau's director the day after his retirement reception, was a single paragraph that the director shared with no one, and that was recovered from his personal archive 15 years later by an archivist who was compiling the Bureau's institutional history for its 400th anniversary. The paragraph said, "I want to note for my own record that I rejected Yemi Adami-Cross's application 9 times over 4 years, and I was correct each time under the framework I was given. And the framework was correct based on what was known when it was written. And she built a drive that made the framework's central assumption incorrect. And I think the right response to that, now that I have had 3 years to consider it, is not embarrassment but something closer to gratitude. Because the framework was limiting something that should not have been limited, and she removed the limitation by building the thing that proved the limitation was wrong. And I would rather work in a system where that is possible than in one where it is not. And I am aware that I was the mechanism of the limitation for several of those years, and I have thought about that, and I think thinking about it was the right thing to do, and I have done it, and what I have arrived at is this. She was right and the work was right, and I am glad the work was done." The Bureau's revised ruling reached Taran's workstation on a Tuesday morning, which was the same day of the week that Yemi had received her 9th rejection, which was not a coincidence she had planned but which she noticed and mentioned to him when he forwarded the ruling to her. He said, "Tuesday." She said, "Yes." He said, "Should I find that significant?" She said, "I find it funny." He said, "You find it funny that the Bureau took 4 years to approve something you proved in 11 seconds." She said, "I find it funny that it took them 14 months after the licensing approval to process the policy implication, and that the policy implication document is longer than the drive's technical specification, and that the part of the document that describes what the architecture does is 2 pages, and the part that describes what the architecture means for the existing regulatory framework is 46 pages. He said, "You're not wrong that that is funny." She said, "Bureaucracies are funny. They are also necessary. The framework that rejected me 8 times is the same framework that created the licensing pathway I used, that funded the journal that published my test data, that established the open materials database I used to identify the lattice materials, and that issued the ruling that lets commercial operators use the architecture without building their own legal argument for it. I am not in favor of removing the framework. I am in favor of the framework being forced periodically to update itself." He said, "You did the forcing. She said someone was going to. It happened to be me, he said. You are being modest. She said, I am being accurate. It happened to be me this time. There will be a next time with a different problem and a different person, and that person will find something the framework did not know to account for, and they will build it, and the framework will update, and that is how it is supposed to work. He looked at her for a moment. He said, you have thought about this. She said, I had 4 years of rejection letters to think during. He said, fair enough. She said, make coffee. He made coffee. The Adiz is still flying. This is not a metaphor. The vessel is 38 meters, crew capacity of 12, now 12 years old, and it has logged 1,241 corridor transits across every corridor classification in the Assembly's registry, including 3 Category 0 primary corridors that the licensing framework had not when Yemi built the drive. Included in the alternative compliance pathway, and that required a separate application and a separate technical review, and that were approved after a 6-month review process that was faster than any previous Category 0 licensing application in the Bureau's history, which the Bureau's director attributed to the completeness of the technical documentation, and which Yemi attributed to the 12 years of operational data that the Adiz had accumulated. And that made the safety case for the architecture in terms that were very difficult to argue with when the argument required suggesting that 1,241 successful transits were insufficient evidence of reliability. The drive architecture is licensed to 41 operators as of the current year. 14 of those operators are human. 27 are from other species. Because the architecture that Yemi had built to solve a specifically human problem, the absence of neural synchronization, turned out to solve a broader problem that other species had been living with in different forms. The requirement for biological neural synchronization was a burden on every species that used corridor drives, not just the ones that lacked the capability, and an architecture that replaced the biological requirement with a computational one improved conditions for operators across the board. This was not something Yemi had designed for. It was something that emerged from designing honestly for the problem she had, which is what honest design tends to produce, solutions that are more general than the specific problem they address. Because honest solutions go deep enough to address the thing underneath the specific problem. And the thing underneath specific problems tends to be something that a lot of people are dealing with from different angles. Taran Moschen is the chief engineer of the company that manufactures the architecture's commercial drives, which Yemi founded in the 7th year of the Adiz operation and which she named, in the practical tradition of naming things after what they do, Corridor Works. Not romantic, functional. It was accurate, and accurate was what she had always been, and accurate was what had gotten her here, through 8 rejections and 14 months and 11 seconds and 4 years of looking at the gap between 2 databases that no one else had thought to cross-reference. And here was a company and a ship and a drive and a ruling and 41 licensed operators and 1,241 transits, and a Veth mathematician's theoretical paper that was not theoretical anymore. And a conference room on the 14th floor where a man had stamped a form and said come back in 40 years, and she had not come back in 40 years, she had come back in 4 with data, and the data had said everything that needed to be said, and the saying had lasted, and the lasting was the whole thing, and the whole thing was this. They told her humans don't belong in space, and she had built a ship and proved them right about that, because the space she belonged in was not the space they had defined, and the ship she built was not the ship they had imagined, and the belonging she had was not the belonging they had permitted, and none of that had mattered because she had not been building toward their permission. She had been building toward the corridor, and the corridor was open, and the Adiz was flying, and it had always been going to be flying. From the moment she sat in the conference room and heard the stamp and thought, not 40 years.